Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about the Jobava London with an early c5 move. We're going to be talking about how to beat this variation and all of the ideas and the theory with the white pieces. Black is playing very aggressively, and in chess, when you get met with aggression, you have to fight back with aggression. Obviously, not in real life. Mostly, it depends on what kind of neighborhood you live in, so be careful with that. Don't take that advice to anything outside of chess. But the main move here is e3, and this is a very passive move. I really dislike this move, and it has scored very, very poorly for white. In fact, black wins most of these games just because after something like this, you get this IQP. You have to move this knight back to e2 and play c3 if you want to solidify the pawn structure, and it just gets very annoying because you're really not able to create any sort of attacks. All of your pieces are kind of cramped up together, and the game at best is going to end in a quick draw. So instead of that, we can play the very dynamic move e4. This move has been popularized by two grandmasters, Hans Demon and Alexander Bortnik, who are both very, very well-renowned Jobava London System players. They're very good with this opening, and so if they both play it very consistently, I'm gonna trust them. I've reviewed this line and I've reviewed this move, and there's basically three things we have to discuss. Let's start with d takes e4, which is the most sort of intuitive move. It prevents this knight from taking because this knight protects his pawn, and so then we just play d takes c5. Now, the material balance has sort of been restored. Now let's look at what might happen. So there's kind of two moves here, queen takes d1 and queen a5. Let's start with queen takes d1 as it's the more forcing move. You play rook takes d1, and now you have a very well-placed rook. Your pieces are very active, and your development is very simple from there. There's like 50 things your opponent might do. Let's talk about some potential mistakes. For example, if knight c6, right away you have knight b5, which is the main idea in the Jobava London. You go knight b5 and then knight c7 check. The only way for black to defend this without losing an insane amount of material is e5. You still play knight c7 check, king e7, only move, and bishop takes e5. So the reason for that is before this bishop gets captured, why not, sacrifice itself for a pawn? And of course, if the knight takes, you take this rook and you're going to be very much winning. You're going to evacuate with knight c7 and whatnot, just drop down this knight. If something insane is played, like rook b8, trying to salvage this rook, actually just bishop d6 check. Wherever this king goes, you might notice there's a discovery on the king. So if this knight gets captured, bishop back to d6, and then you just win this rook. So I'd say that this is a pretty pleasant position. I wouldn't worry too much about that. If you get to encounter this, you're going to be very much fine. Of course, it's not, guaranteed that your opponent plays knight c6, but if they do, right away, it should be automatic that the moment you see knight c6, you can pretty much guarantee to jump into b5 in a lot of Jobava London lines. If your opponent plays more principled and goes something like bishop g4, which does not allow knight b5 because knight a6, but also your rook is hanging, the move I recommend against bishop g4 is this very nice move, bishop b5 check, knight c6, and knight ge2. Now you have a lot of active pieces, black cannot castle, and you're kind of looking for a win here. So after something like e6, bishop back to e3, this defends your pawn from the bishop, being able to capture it. Bishop e7, h3, you don't want this bishop to stay here, it's very strong. If the bishop goes back, you can continue with g4, and this is a very nice position. You've expanded on the queen side. You've expanded on the king side, and you're not gonna castle king side. Most definitely, you're just gonna start pushing these pawns up and seeing where that takes you. And your opponent cannot castle queen side, so your opponent's pretty much forced to either stay in the center or castle king side, where he's going to get run down by all of your pawns. So instead of that, if your opponent takes this knight, you can recapture the king. You don't want to capture with the knight or anything because the knight is very well placed on c3. And, the queens have been traded off. A lot of the pieces have been traded off. It's very difficult to create any attack on your king, and it's actually, very safe on the e2 square. Black castles, you take this knight, and you play bishop d4. And that's why you took this knight, because otherwise you couldn't play bishop d4 without black capturing this very nice bishop. What are your goals? Well, you want to take this knight, and you want to win this pawn. There's a small problem, though. Let's say your opponent plays something natural like rook of d8. You take, and you take this pawn. You lose the b2 pawn. Now, one could argue that white is still a lot better in this position because of this very nice d6 square, which the knight can jump into. However, in a blitz game or in a rapid game, which is what most Jobava London games end up being, blitz and rapid games, because they're very dynamic and double-edged, very difficult to convert this position. And I would say that even though on paper you do have the advantage, not everything in life comes down to what is on paper. So instead of that, I would suggest a more interesting move, and one that is very thematic for the Jobava London. And instead of taking this knight, we play g4. Very aggressive move. Why are we playing g4? Well, we want to play g5, kick this knight out, and knight takes c4, protecting this pawn. Follow up with something like h4, be completely fine and just up a clean pawn. If your opponent runs like h5, which is the engine's choice, take this knight out, take this pawn, and you're just happy. You're up a clean pawn. There is no compensation for black in this sort of structure. It's just entirely +1 because you won a free pawn. And if your opponent decides to be a little bit annoying with something like h6, you can actually just play b3. And then you can take the knight on the next move and knight takes c4. The reason you're playing b3 is to just say a random move like rook c8. I just want to demonstrate. Now, you can notice that this bishop cannot capture the b2 pawn because there is no pawn on b2. And therefore, we're once again +1 in a very nice position. Okay, that sums up queen takes d1. Now let's look at queen a5. So queen a5 is an interesting move. It aims to recapture this pawn with dividends. And it also puts pressure on the c3 knight because it's pinned to the king. Queen d2, removing the pin from this knight. Before we talk about the main move, which is knight c6, if your opponent captures this pawn, you can castle queenside, and now you're threatening checkmate. You can also threaten knight b5 after something like knight c6, which can stop this checkmate threat. You right away have knight b5, which completely wins the game. For example, something like e5, you can actually go knight c7 anyway. Your opponent has to go to king e7, that is the only move. And then you can go bishop e3, and now you're no longer losing this bishop because this queen has to move somewhere since it's being attacked. And wherever it moves, you just take this rook and you're up an entire exchange. Well, you're up an entire rook, but you might lose a knight. And during the time that your opponent tries to recapture your knight, you can spend all of that time developing your pieces and getting an active attack, you know. Chess.com evaluates this as +6. I completely agree. I think this is a completely winning position. And if you get here, you really don't need my guidance. I think you're going to be able to fare quite well on your own. Also, it's important to note that if your opponent does something odd like this is main one. So just remember, you also have queen moves, which can completely destroy your opponent almost immediately. And this is sort of the drawback of your opponent, you know, going for early queen moves and not developing his pieces early enough. Okay, knight c6, long castle. We're following sort of the same line. And then if, of course, we can transpose into the exact same line with queen takes c5. But basically, your opponent might play a couple of things, such as, you know, bishop g4. We can follow up with knight b5, and we're going for the exact same strategy. Of course, taking this rook is not possible because after knight c7 check, we might notice that this king has no legal moves since this e-pawn has never been moved. The king cannot slide down to e7. The only move for black is to capture this knight, and after dust has settled, we basically win a queen for the price of a rook and a minor piece. And sometimes that's enough for black to hold a draw. This is not one of those cases. In this case, you're much better because there are so many pieces on the board. You have so much piece activity. Your bishop's ready to jump out to b5. You can do so many things here. If, of course, your opponent is a more experienced individual, he will notice that, you know, taking this rook is not the best option and will instead take your queen. You trade, and you're still preparing knight c7. So your opponent might play e5 in order to stop this check. However, it does not, in fact, stop the check, and you can still do it and win this rook. And then you can just head back to knight c7, and you're going to be very much happy in that position. Your opponent gets a lot of counterplay with these very advanced pawns, so it's very important to mitigate the dangers of that by divert all of your attention into disrupting these pawns. So that can be done numerous ways. I mean, you can just play, you know, knight d5, trade all of these pieces off, and then start bringing your pieces out to e2. You can even play f3 in some lines. Yeah, it really depends on how your opponent handles this situation, but regardless of what they do, you're always going to be better. That summarizes d takes e4. Now let's look at the move knight takes e4. By the way, if you've been finding this video useful, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps my channel out a ton, and it will help you stay notified when future videos like this come out. Thank you. So knight takes e4 is the most popular move, and it makes a lot of sense, because after knight takes e4 and d takes e4 once again, we notice that this pawn is not currently capturable, and we're just down a pawn. However, we follow up with d takes c5, which is, you know, the most logical move. Now the material balance has been restored yet again. And again, we have the same two options, queen takes d1 and queen a5. Let's talk about queen takes d1 right away. Rook recaptures, and there's two major differences in this position. For one, there's no knight on c3, which can jump into b5, so we lose some, you know, tactical abilities here. And two, your opponent is very underdeveloped. So we might notice the opponent has no pieces out. He's going to face a lot of difficulty with developing. e6, b4. We want to protect this pawn, and we like this bishop on f4 right now because this file, or this diagonal, is very open, so it's very good on this square. And the line kind of ends here. There's really nothing else to follow up with. Black cannot develop this dark square bishop. He can only put on e7. And then have to castle. If black chooses to place this knight on c6, we can follow up with a3 or c3. I like a3 more. And then we can also actually follow up with just bishop b5, which is arguably maybe even slightly better. Both of them are completely fine. And now you have this very, very strong queenside sort of pawn chain. This is something you will kind of see a lot in some of the lines of the solid defense from Black's perspective. So it's very interesting that we have this playing as white. And you are, very active in this position. Your rook is very strong. And your opponent is going to try, hopelessly to create some sort of counterplay, but they're just very passive here. If your opponent plays something very simple like this, you can follow up with bishop b5, not rook b5, but bishop b5. And the moment your opponent castles, you can ruin this pawn structure, and you should be quite okay in this position. Knight e2, preparing to castle. You don't even have to castle, but probably recommended to castle just so your rook can get into the game, and you can build off of that. That covers the very simple queen takes d1. Now let's look at queen a5. So this is the move that I have been preparing the most against because it is a check and it does temporarily win this pawn. Now, very interesting here, we play c3, opponent takes a c5 pawn, and we play queen a4 check. So literally just copycat our opponent. Knight c6, and we capture this pawn. At this point, the development is quite equal for both sides. We can quickly place a rook on d1 though, and create a lot of counterplay, whereas our opponent will struggle to find a spot for his king. He has to play something like e6 and follow up with, various strategies. The most popular move in this position is bishop f5, and we can go back to queen to a4, which continues the spin on the knight. And from here, your opponent has a plethora of options. They can play e6, they can play e5, they can long castle. If they play e5, you can just, actually drop this bishop back to e3, pressure this queen, get it to move out of the way, and then follow up with rook d1, since the queen on a4 also supports the rook on d1. And in a lot of cases, that does help out, especially if your opponent long castles. But yeah, in terms of ideas, a lot of the time I want to play bishop e3 and kick this queen out of its very nice c5 square. You want to place the rook on d1, bishop on e2, knight on f3. You want to castle short. Most of these cases, your opponent is going to be castling queenside. But if not, you still want to secure safety of the king, because right now the king is very exposed and very much not safe. And from there, you're going to have to abuse piece activity in order to go for a advantage. It's very difficult to push the queenside pawns when your king is in this position. And you definitely don't want to be castled the queenside here, because all of these light squares are very weak. And as you can notice, there's a light square bishop, which is just there to exploit these weaknesses. So avoid castling queenside in this sort of line. Instead, develop normally, castle, place a rook on d1, maybe even double your rooks, and you'll be good from there. That covers everything to do with knight takes e4. It's a very tricky line, but as I showcased, you shouldn't be really worried about anything. You have just enough piece activity, and you have enough time to get your king to safety, so there's nothing to be worried about. Now let's talk about a sort of sideline move that I haven't really seen that much, but it has been played, which is c takes d4, which is the original plan, because after e3, that is the best move for black, simply to ruin this pawn structure. So after e4, it would make sense for your opponent to try the same thing. But here it doesn't quite have the same sting, because we just recapture with our queen. After knight c6, it may seem as though, oh, we're getting tempoed because we have to move this queen. But not quite. We play bishop b5, and after bishop d7, we take this knight, and we play e5. So we have, entirely superior development in this position, but this pawn on e5 does block the bishop's sort of sight. And so what we have to realize is that in these positions, we're going to be playing e6 a lot and sacrificing this pawn in order to, well, open up this bishop, but also to ruin our opponent's pawn structure. So if your opponent plays the very intuitive, knight e4, you just play e6 right away. Knight takes e3. You can either take this knight with the pawn and then just, capitalize off of this weakness, or you can start by actually taking this pawn with check and then taking this knight, and either one works fine. You still have an advantage in either variation, and I'd be happy to play white from both of these options. If your opponent chooses to take right away, there are a couple of options. You can play knight ge2, and now this straight is never going to be dangerous because you never have to ruin your pawn structure. Oh, and by the way, if you do have to ruin your pawn structure, something like this, you can always play c4, and you will be fine. You can play c4 and to undouble your pawns to challenge black center, so that should be quite okay. But yeah, if your opponent just takes this pawn, knight ge2, nothing to be scared of, and life just sort of goes on from there. You have a very strong bishop. You can castle queenside. You can put this bishop on e5 if you'd like, and you can punish black for his lack of activity. If you notice something, is that black has a very difficult time activating his pieces. And I apologize if you guys hear any background noise or somebody outside cutting lawns. But regardless, e6 is the move. Of course, the more popular move is knight d7. It is a little bit more solid. You still follow up with e6. After f takes e6, you play knight f3, and you're going to capitalize off of black's lack of development. So the best move is queen b6. Everything else gives us a very solid advantage because we can plant a knight on e5 and then target this e6 pawn. We can also castle either kingside or queenside, and then put our rook on d1 and e1, and we're going to be so strong from there if our opponent doesn't play queen b6. This game is very equal. You can slide down to queen d2. You don't want to take this queen because that just helps black activate his pieces. And if black falls into the trap of taking the pawn, you can, first of all, secure king safety with castling. After something like g6 trying to activate this bishop, rook b1, queen a3, knight g5. And knight g5 attacks this e6 pawn as evident. After bishop g7, which makes a lot of sense, if you just take this pawn, you end up losing completely. So instead of that, after bishop g7, you can play rook b3. This sends the queen to a5, and then you can take this e6 pawn with no repercussions. And after something like rook g1, protecting this bishop from being captured, rook e1, and you cannot tell me that this isn't a great position. Your pieces are so well placed and so active. You can always play bishop h6 if you'd like to trade the bishop off. Your rook is very active, both on e1 and b3. This knight is on a monster square. It literally controls half of the board from here. This is almost an ideal position for any Jobava London player. If your opponent doesn't fall for this trap of taking the pawn, your opponent might be using an engine and play the move d4, which is the top engine move. And it's hard to explain why, because it technically is a pawn sacrifice. But you're back to equal material, and some of the activity from your position does diminish because of the queen trade. And so that kind of does equate to a more balanced sort of structure. Here, this move e5 doesn't really work because we can take on c6, and after f takes e4, we can simply slide back to b5 with the idea of putting a knight on this d5 square, being reinforced by the other knight, and being able to recapture this pawn at any time. Guys, this really summarizes c takes d5. Not a scary variation whatsoever, and we end up with a lot of piece activity and very, very pleasant positions, actually. Now, lastly, I do want to mention this e6 move just temporarily. It is a move that can be played, but it really goes against the whole point of black playing c5, because going for this ultra aggressive move and then to just slowly reinforce our structure doesn't make that much sense. And we play knight b5 and go for this whole knight c7 idea. Apologies for the arrows. After knight a6, e5, kicking this knight out, knight d7, and then knight f3, and you just get more piece activity. But most of the time, you're probably going to keep this knight on b5 or drop it back to c3 if you need to. You can develop this bishop, queen d2, and you can actually castle queenside in these positions. But it really is up to you. You can also castle kingside. You should have an advantage either way, because you do have, better piece placement and more piece activity than your opponent, especially with this knight on a6, which is just terrible. And yeah, that summarizes e6. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes everything I wanted to show you for this c5 line. I hope you guys found this video informative and useful, and if you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.